1, 2, 3 microphone tests.
5, 6, 7 test back.
It works. Yeah. And it's the top of the hour, and it looks like we have critical mass.
Yes, just before we get started into everything, Vadim, could you try whether your audio works as well? Then I guess I'll leave you some time to search for to look into the mute to find the microphone button. It's top bottom left. And other than that, let's get started. Hello everyone. This is an interim meeting of the CBOR working group. Barry and I are chairs of this working group, with Carsten occasionally doing delegate duties if we are not around. Please be aware of the note well, which applies to all IETF activities. And that being said, let's start into the agenda for today. We have a lot of things to discuss around this time. One thing that we've often talked about recently that we will not talk about today is EDN, because we have other things that just got sidetracked by the EDN discussions, and because there is a few open points that might better work on the mailing list anyway. The large topics are CDE, where Lawrence will be given a brief statement on why he thinks that a particular aspect of the document is unnecessary and just overcomplicating things, to which I think Carsten also has a few points, to which he has slides. And then we'll continue over to Pact CBOR, starting with Carsten, and there is an aspect of the discussion of the larger, do we really want to do Pact CBOR discussion? That is, that there is an alternative proposal that has been floated on the mailing list a few days ago, and Vadim will say a few words on that. I'd like to ask all presenters to keep it concise, because we have 60 minutes of total meeting and want to like 3/4 presentation slots, so please stick with tops 10 minutes, rather 6 to 8, and I'll try to stay on top of timekeeping a bit. If we get to it, there is an errata item that has been reported which we might talk about, but that is in the like possibly spillover part of the meeting. Did I miss anything that anyone wants to talk about, or is there anything about the sequence that you would rather have differently? Hearing none, just before we get started, Vadim, could you try your microphone again, just so that we see that kind of you're connected?
Hi, test.
Hello, yes, we hear you, all is fine. Thanks a lot. We'll come back to you at the later in the part. And by the way, welcome to IETF interim meetings. I think this is the first time you're participating in one. Okay. That being said,
the loudness is not how to volume up in this application.
I think you'll have to do that. I think you'll have to do that outside of the application. There's a volume setting, but that's by default on maximum. But at least we hear you all. Okay. With no changes to the agenda, Lawrence, please start with your point on the on CDE, and I'll pass slide control to you. You already uploaded them.
Okay, good morning or good afternoon. There we go. So we've had about a year of discussion on application profiles and ALDR, and CBOR, canonical CBOR and CDE have been deployed for about 10 plus years, starting with RFC 7049. I believe no substantial threat to CDE has emerged in those in all this discussion and in those 10 years. Some threat of it being mutated or twisted or put to use or damaged or something like that. So I think we have had time for an experience, time for discussion. So I think we can conclude there's not any example of a substantial threat to CDE. There's one use case for ALDR at this point, which is CBOR. And I think we understand that CBOR is not a threat to CDE. It layers on top of ALDR just fine. And the ALDR layer doesn't really change how CBOR layers over CDE. So I basically believe we have no justification for use cases and no examples for ALDR or application profiles. And so if we have no justification for it, then the point is, well, it's innocuous. Can we just put it in anyways because it's innocuous, even though. And I think it's implementers need to read all the text. So any text we put in there is something that costs people. I mean, I've certainly been beat up for not reading all of the text at times when I miss something or other than that. So I find it burdensome. Another point I think is that CBOR is fairly old now. We're in a refinement period for things like this. I mean, there's certainly new things being added to CBOR, but I see this as a third generation CBOR document. So it's a refinement of 7049, which is a refinement of 8949. I don't think we should be mucking around with CDE. We don't want to introduce new comments or new concepts in third generation documents without resounding community support. I think we do not have that. We do not have a lot of people implementing ALDR or other use cases for it. And then generally, ecosystem liability. All text is a liability in any IETF document because the working group has to process it, reviewers, editors, readers, future readers, potential readers in the future. So I don't think it's okay to just put text in because it's innocuous without a use case and examples. That said, because there's some confusion about my position and others, I believe CDE is absolutely a critical part of CBOR. Obviously, it's been in there forever in some form. It's a small number of use cases, but CDE is absolutely critical for them. I also believe that this draft is useful. It provides some clarifications to the definition of CDE, which are useful, and that it adds CDDL for CDE. And the last comment I'm going to make is I believe we need working group consensus here, and I don't really. I mean, all I'm after here is working group consensus. Whatever the working group consensus is, I'm fine with that. But at this point, it seems like we do not have consensus to put this in the document, so it should go out. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. Questions, direct comments? So with just comment from me with my chair hat off, this does sound convincing to me. There should kind of, especially the aspect of introducing concepts to the ecosystem where we don't even have good examples is a point that resonates well with me, because it's one thing to not do something just because we lack the imagination of how it would be used, and another thing to talk a lot about it without being able to give examples. I suppose, Carsten, you're from the context of the slides, that you have something that you would reply with your slides already. Yep.
Yes.
Thought so.
Okay, is everybody seeing my slides?
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about CDE for the moment, or actually not talk about CDE, actually. Yeah, so just as a reminder, CDE has been around for a little more than a year as a document. Of course, as a concept, it's much older. As Lawrence pointed out, we had an initial canonical representation in 1749 that we found out violated the principles of least surprise. So 8949 has a slightly different thing called core requirements for deterministic encodings, and that's what I think everybody agrees is good. But we have a little bit of frayed edges of that, and that's what we are trying to fix with the CDE document. And I would like to working group class call CDE. So the word that some people don't like is ALDR, application layer deterministic representation, and that's essentially yeah, a fact. If you want to have deterministic representation, you need deterministic encoding, and you need some form to get your application to actually spit out deterministic CBOR, so it can be deterministically encoded. So these two things are not severable. They are part of the same thing. And the point is that all of our use cases are actually deterministic representation use cases and not just deterministic encoding use cases. So what ALDR means is that the application describes how application data should be represented in CBOR, so that the data with the same semantics always have the same representation in the generic CBOR data model. That is what ALDR is. And I would really like to point out, this is not unnecessary. This is, I'm sorry, but you need this to get deterministic representation. Now I have to read the chat. Well, yeah, Joe's right, but that's not the part that we are talking about. So ALDR as a concept isn't new. We just never isolated a term for it. And when you read section 422 of RFC 8949, this is really to a large part about application level deterministic representation issues. Because 421 does a reasonable job of describing the CDE level issues. But 422 is a pretty muddled section if you read it, because it didn't clearly separate the encoding aspect. So how do you represent this? Do you use 2-byte floating points or 4-byte floating points, and so on? And versus the representation in the data model. So for instance, in the data model, you get to decide whether you put a tag on something or send it raw. And those are things that need to be done at the application level. And yeah, we mixed this up in 422, and that really was the problem we had in the last decade, that we didn't have a good understanding that ALDR actually is different from CDE, but is a very important part of the whole issue of deterministic representation. So you could simply say that ALDR is not a concept, but just a fact. An application that wants to create deterministic CBOR messages needs to create CBOR. And if it only has data at rest that isn't already CBOR formatted, it has to make decisions how to represent those data at rest at the CBOR level, decisions about the conversion of those data at rest to the generic CBOR data model. And that's ALDR. ALDR is nothing but that concept, that you have to make sure your data actually are represented in a deterministic way as well before you hand it over to deterministic encoding. So you can just do this, but it's just better to have a term for that. ALDR are often represented in a different way, or not really thought about that way, because it's relatively natural to think about that if you think about deterministic representation. But you have to do it. So for instance, for a timestamp, if you have a timestamp in your application protocol, then you need to decide which of the several ways to represent timestamps in CBOR you are using. And the objective to achieve deterministic representation here may not be explicit, but it may be a strong objective. It may also fail if you, for instance, have both floating point and integer representation for tag 1. You are not done with ALDR yet. And you may have to include an additional rule in your protocol definition that says, well, always use floating point or always use integer or something like that. So can you implement CDE without understanding ALDR? Absolutely. Well, the whole point about CDE is that it finally has a well-defined boundary to ALDR. So it does not include ALDR, and that's really the point. Well, can you use CDE without understanding ALDR? Probably, but somebody has to do the ALDR for you. So for instance, if you already have rules that explicitly describe how to convert your application data into CBOR form, you may be done with your ALDR requirements. Or if your application data are already in CBOR form, if you're writing a server that replies to messages that are already in CBOR form, you may not need to think about that. And there are also applications that don't really care about determinism that much. So your application doesn't malfunction if you occasionally spit out two different representations of something. You just don't get the full benefit of deterministic representation. So let me just give an example of how ALDR is done in current RFCs. I have always used CWT, but that's a bad example because it's not actually using deterministic encoding.
Just brief note, please. Kind of have a look at the time. Continue, but be quick.
Yes. So I have 3 slides left. So RFC 9679 defines the thumbprint of a COSI key. And to do that, it actually uses deterministic encoding for the COSI key data structure and computes a hash. So that's really hard to do without deterministic encoding. So I understand Joe's point. You normally don't want to use it, but in this case, it's actually what you want. RFC 9679, COSI thumbprint, needs ALDR, and it has a whole section that does nothing else but ALDR. The whole section 4 is the ALDR section of 9679. They just didn't have a term for it, so they didn't use it, but they did it. And here's an example of how ALDR comes in. There are 2 ways to represent ECC information. One is compressed and one is uncompressed. And the ALDR here, the ALDR rule is you must use the uncompressed form. So if you have a compressed form internally in your non-CBOR data, then you actually have to compute the Y coordinate and insert it into the key before you actually hand it over to deterministic encoding. Okay, so that's an example that probably is better, and it really shows if you actually are using deterministic encoding, and I agree with Joe, you must have a really good reason to do that, then you need ALDR. So should we have a term for that? Yes. The reason that people are denying that ALDR even exists is probably a good reason to actually have the term already. So what do we get from not having the term? yeah, one appendix less. I agree with Lawrence that every piece of text is a liability. But yeah, the what we also get is that we lose the information that application data often need ALDR care before they can be handed to CDE. And we also see something else, which is maybe not as visible in the IETF because people generally know how to use CBOR, but which I'm seeing in other SCOs. So people actually think, oh, here's some requirement that deterministic encoding in CBOR doesn't do, so let's modify deterministic encoding. And that's something that you need to counter by saying, hey, that's stuff you do at the application layer. That's not stuff you do in the encoding layer. And that's really useful to have the ALDR term. So people need to get to understand that they don't need to change CDE to actually get the application layer requirement covered. And yeah, as we experience, as we witness, if you don't have the term, then you have inefficient discussions. So that's my last slide.
Thank you. Lawrence, do you want to respond immediately? I think that's...
Yeah. I mean, it's application profiles and ALDR have been presented as a defense against this extreme threat. The words were, I think the threat was immense or something like that. So I still think the case hasn't been, I mean, that hasn't been supported. I mean, there's no, we're still lacking all the examples and all of that and the motivation here. When I see the slides here, it looks more like a refinement of 4.2.2, which is kind of explaining how applications can do their own deterministic encoding for stuff that is beyond CDE. That's all quite reasonable. But as a layer that must be forced in here, it's presented as a layer, not as like an implementation technique. If it's presented as some implementation techniques with wording that's much clearer, the wording is, I find, very difficult. I mean, this presentation is starting to make it more reasonable. And as a refinement of 4.2.2, that seems much more reasonable to me.
Yeah, I think it's good that we have this discussion now in a high bandwidth environment. We have had it on the mailing list, but people haven't read documents. So yeah, I agree that we are making progress here. Sorry,
suggestion based on that here. You had this point in there, which is if the application does convert, say, data addressed into a CBOR model. My impression is that when someone sees ALDR as unnecessary, they might come from an environment where that is not the case, where the CBOR information model already is their information model. So both of you, might it make sense if that ALDR terminology and appendix was prefixed with when is this at all relevant, and when can you disregard this because your information model is already in such a way that say a float 16 would be or an integer is distinct from a float, and all those distinctions, or say a tagged date is already distinct from an untagged date.
One thing here, I fear we're muddling data model and serialization. That's not my area of expertise, but my understanding is that this is about serialization, not data model.
Well, actually, it's about representation, not serialization. We generally try to have a very clear layer structure between representation aspects that are at the application layer and representation aspects that are at the encoding layer. And I'm just using the word representation right now to talk about the application part. But I think the main mistake we are having here is to consider ALDR as a layer. It's a technique. It's a way to write specifications. So there is no new layer. The layer is the application, and we are not going to take away the application layer. So yeah, the layering doesn't change.
I think, Dave, you're next in the queue because Lawrence and Carsten just didn't take the hand down.
Okay, hi. I don't normally participate in this and don't jump in because my world is ASN, JSON, and XML, and not CBOR. However, of course, I participate for inspiration for my world, which is mostly ASN and JSON. But I have to pipe up here because if I agree that ALDR is a concept without a name, and that we would just call them application encoding rules or something like that. We've stumbled around with, without having a name. My point of jumping in here is, why is this concept of a new term being buried in an appendix of a CBOR RFC? This is not the right place for it. It seems, based on Carsten's discussion, that this concept applies equally to ASN and JSON and XML and CBOR. Why is this even a CBOR discussion? That's where I'm leaving. It seems to be a more broad a broad thing that deserves its own RFC and its own discussions. That's all.
Yeah, I completely agree. It does occur in the other data representation formats as well. It just often isn't discussed there as much. For instance, in XML, you are so concerned about getting your XML data model right that you usually never think about the world outside of the XML. At least that's the experience I have made when talking with people working on XML. We have a document that actually describes the boundary between information model and a data model that is like 20 years old. Maybe we should have had another 20-year-old document that describes the boundary between application layer data modeling and data serialization. So making bytes out of the application layer model, but we don't have that document. And of course, we could write yet another document for that. We could also move the stuff into the deterministic encoding explainer that I have written. These are all ways of doing this, but I think it's just good for people who think about using CDE to know CDE is not there to solve all their problems, so they shouldn't wonder what's broken with CDE if it doesn't solve that specific problem. And that specific problem has a name, which is called ALDR.
Lawrence?
Yeah, I just want to point out that the DCBOR document was written in terms of an application profile. So it did appear there as a layer.
Yeah, but that's the choice of the DCBOR people to structure the application into a DCBOR layer and something that is on top of that. That's a valid choice. They can do that, but that doesn't mean that it's something that people have to emulate.
I mean, the reason that the DCBOR people used application profiles is kind of that was how they were guided to do it, and application profiles were invented at the time DCBOR was created. When they brought their proposal to the IETF, it did not have application profiles in it, and application profiles didn't exist. And it was fine. So there was a force trying to push a layer in there. It was definitely an approach.
Could that have just been an artifact of the collective learning experience by which we are arriving at ALDR, or the concept of ALDR that we now have?
Yeah,
You
so
could put it that way.
I wondered, why are they doing so many stupid things? And then I noticed that this whole 3-layer model with information models, data models, and serialization isn't as widely known as it should be. I mean, it's not as taught in school like the OSI 7-layer model, which is totally broken. So that was a collective learning experience that we actually have to point out. There is a serialization part of the problem, and there is an application layer part of the problem. And that made them turn CBOR into a thin layer that is between the actual application and CDE. But that's just one way of handling it. It's not necessarily the best way. And I think the important thing we did on the document, culminating in the new version that I submitted yesterday, was to get rid of the term profile, because as usually when somebody uses the term profile, it doesn't add anything. And it really can be confusing, because it sounds like you are sitting in a restaurant and have to choose the entree and the dessert. And that's not the point here. You have to solve your problems. And some of these are at the application layer, and some of those are in the encoding.
Dave?
Yeah, I don't want to debate, but I have to say I'm trying to agree entirely that this is a huge, wide-ranging concept that is not taught in schools. Everything Carsten just said, it's as equally important as the 7-layer rule. It's the layer between encoding and application, and it's extremely important as a concept. It needs to be elevated, and if it doesn't have a name, let's give it a name. But why are we burying such an important concept in an appendix of a CBOR document? I really think this is the wrong place for introducing something that should be taught in schools. I'm trying to agree with that it's way more important than an appendix of one serialization syntax. So I think it deserves to be brought out separately, and certainly I don't want to introduce a wide-ranging IETF name that everybody's going to start using and referring to, and the first place you introduced it is in an appendix in a CBOR document. Just doesn't seem appropriate.
I think I might be next in the queue. That makes sense to me. And so I was just saying in the chat that if we were to do that, then probably doing it with all of art makes sense, because it crosses over a bunch of application layer stuff. We could use that as an opportunity to describe all the layers and the transitions between them, and set up a conceptual model for future kinds of art protocols.
Yeah, that sounds like the right way to do if we had 10 years of time doing this stuff. Meanwhile, people are inventing protocols and not understanding the issue. And I'd like to get this document out there.
I mean,
yeah, I think there is a difference between what we would be doing in an ideal world and what we should be doing in January 2025.
So, I mean, there's this saying about the best time being 10 years ago, but the best time being now. Would you generally be willing to participate in like writing this up as a larger concept? And if so, what is the if that becomes, as I hear many people say, it's kind of something that would make sense as a larger thing? What's the minimum? What's like the minimum forward addition to a forward pointer that you think would be required to satisfy the kind of to make people not fall into the trap already?
Well, the problem with writing that document is that we need a document that introduces this 3-layer model, and that is first of all independent of the determinism issue. And then we started doing that by discussing this model at an IAB workshop in 2016. And I think most people who come out of the context of that IAB workshop have internalized that discussion enough that they are actually applying this model. But if you discuss it in the general art environment, then of course there will be influences from many sides, and that will take a couple of years. So I would prefer to actually describe our little corner of that world that is relevant to this document in this appendix, even if it's a little bit confusing, because it assumes that you have been there in San Francisco in 2016. Much over doing nothing for 2 years.
Before wrapping up, Lawrence, you've been in the queue before. Is there something that you'd like to add here?
Lawrence, can you send the ChatGPT output to the list, please?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. Editorial comments are really useful.
I mean, I still think that we don't have this large number of people designing protocols incorrectly. I mean, Karsten, says he knows of them from other working groups, but I mean, it's
not working groups. It's outside the IETF.
So describe them and be respectful to us and describe them, and rather than
I also need to be respectful to them.
Don't interrupt me, please. Please describe them so you don't set us up like you act like it's a big mystery and like tell us stuff and then you don't describe it. It's really disrespectful to the working group and those of us that try to participate in it to interact that way. So you really, I mean, I believe my slides hold. There was no case made in this working group. This discussion is different, but it really does need to be. I mean, you really need to make the case, and I mean, this discussion is helpful, but and I can see a direction for it to go now. But the idea that you kind of just invoke some mysterious thing that we don't know about is not okay.
There's other SDOs have other rules about how open they are, which information stays confidential, and so on. And it would be very disrespectful to actually talk about details of those other SDOs. So I'm not going to try that here. Maybe I can cook up something that doesn't violate the rules of the other SDOs, but I'm not promising this.
Not asking you to violate, just say that, SDO XX did something like that, and XDO YY said something like that. That's all.
Yeah. So for instance, Etsy is one SDO that seriously has run into problems because of this.
Okay, thanks everyone. I don't think that we have a full conclusion here, but we should also move on. Karsten, do you have takeaways with which you could dress this better to be understood by a larger audience to be helpful?
Well, I think my work program is to finally completely get rid of the profile. I think it still occurs 3 times in the current draft. Make sure that we actually use the much easier to understand example of the CBOR, COSI thumbprint, COSI keys thumbprint in the appendix, and do some editorial rework, for instance, based on what Lawrence has dug out of ChatGPT. So that would be my program, and get a Desho 8 out before the next interim, so we have that part covered. Of course, it would also be good if people would be reviewing the other parts of the document, because the next thing we want to do is a working group last call, so it would be good if people were making up their minds about the rest of the document.
Thank you. Moving on, there's another to me a bit surprisingly controversial topic currently on the list, that is moving forward with Pact CBOR. Carsten, I think you're already in control of the slide.
Yes.
We have 20 minutes left, and I'd really like to see what Vadim is proposing you to. So can you do your introduction in 5-ish minutes?
Yes. So just to remind people what CBOR Pact is, it is not another data compression scheme. We have a few of those. We might want to choose one for constraint devices at some point, which is something that leaked through the discussion a little bit, but this is not the point of this draft. But this draft is about saving space at the data model level. That's why I call it packing and not compression. And that means that both sides, both the encoder, the emitter, and the consumer can directly work out of stored packed representations. They never need to expand the document to the full tree. And this would also make the packed implementation much more accessible to constraint implementation, high performance implementations, which is also an application. So what CBOR Pact is very typical for something that happens in the CBOR space, because it really is just a set of tags. So we are using the existing extension points to define two different things. One that is meant to be stable and not be growing or changing much. Of course, you never know what the future will bring, but they are designed to be stable. Those are the reference tags. And the other one is the table building tags, which are really the more application specific aspect. How do you actually fill the tables that are then used by the reference mechanism? And again, it's nice to separate this, although we have some earlier tags that actually combined both functions into a single tag. I'm not saying the approach is wrong, but it's not the approach that was taken here. So you use CBOR Pact by actually adopting this as a way to express your application protocol. I did write a generic compressor based on Pact, but this really was just for explorative purposes. So why does it make sense to have a common set of reference tags across different applications? First of all, it allows you to have generic ingesting implementations, if only just for diagnostic purposes. It allows sharing tags between application protocols, and it saves application protocol designers some reinvention. Yeah, really don't apply your reflexes from 20 years, 25 years of working with data compression algorithms, 25, 45 years, to this document, because it's not a data compression mechanism. And things like ZMA are really good, and there's absolutely no point to writing anything if we are not actually doing something that advances the CBOR ecosystem. Okay, so that doesn't mean that we occasionally have to have a look on what our compression factor is, but it's not the main point here. So there have been several technical points coming up, which are of a very different nature. One was that people don't like using ranges of tags. Well, yeah, nobody likes this, but we made a really wrong decision in 2013 by only having tags with one argument. You can put an array there, of course, but that actually costs bytes that you're trying to save in a packing scheme. So people have been using ranges of tags, and I don't agree with Joe that this is something that needs to be stopped. It's actually the way we do things here. Second issue, and that's really a very, very valid discussion, how much of the free space of tags, I mean, the free space of tags is really large, but some tags are better than others. So how much of the space of good tags, short tags, and of simple values, which we also use to save tags. How much should we actually use? Joe, it's not but just my documents that use ranges of tags. Sizing this allocation is a real engineering discussion, because we are trading Marshmallow now, which means the CBOR packing works great. With Marshmallow in the future, we still have tags available that we can use for new schemes. So we will have to do some haggling there, and I totally acknowledge that. We also could change the whole way of expressing these reference tags. So I have a design for that. That's a pretty obvious way of doing things. Preliminary studies says it's losing about 1.2 bytes per reference tag, or per reference, which is a problem for some people and not a problem for other people. So again, that's an engineering decision. Do we want to do that? Obviously, it's not just an engineering motivation here, because we might want to do this just to get this document through with less discussion. I would be sad if that was the reason why we are doing this. But yeah, we need to discuss that. So I think that's good. And one other thing that is good is people have been looking at this subject from scratch. And the next thing here is Vadim, who has some ideas. I wouldn't say a proposal, we are not quite there yet, but some ideas that might be interesting.
Just briefly on the argument of like how are ranges used. I'm just scanning through the list of assigned tags, and all the ranges that I've found so far are for bare hash values, which is one of Carsten's drafts, and the content format assignments, in which I think Carsten was a contributor. So yeah, but then again, that's many of the doc. Yeah. For example, records by Chris Zip also use that kind of ranges. So there are many examples where Carsten has been using it, but it's not only him. For example, Greg Bernstein has used them for W3C applications around the 14 million tag range, range in the area of 14 million. So it's definitely not just Carsten. Okay. Given that we're late in the progress, you already did the introduction. So Vadim, please, I'll hand things over to you. I'm opening your slides, but I will then pass slide control to you. So you should be, you should now have like forward and back buttons on your Android device, and then see from your PC also the slides. Does that work for you?
Oh, at least, thanks. So it's too many materials. So first slides I will skip for just a few seconds, just to leave them in the video recording. So CBOR was part of new layer 4, layer 5 transport protocol, in which the main problem is the main constraint resource is bandwidth, packet size, and so good compression was needed. And SSH2 was selected for it instead of TLS. So SSH2 protocol also have repeatable strings. So I was in need to compress both generic blobs from protocol, which I don't want to parse myself, leaving it to the library. And the same for CBOR. First, I tried to make a custom thing, calling it compact binary arrays records, doing it on sub-byte resolution for to save a little, but then I considered it too complex, so the better to get generic CBOR decoder. So need a way to compress CBOR. Then I take idea from X11 or Lisp for using atoms. Atom is an integer in a place for string. Pretty common idea. So CBOR pact is revolving some around this in its shared tables. So and as it was generic blobs, so I went via bytecode way. That is some values. Let's not retalk the spec that was posted on my list. Just go to examples. So for best compression, CBOR is best wrapped into byte string. But for simple use cases, as you can see on this slide, the single tag can be prepended to just an integer, just like in CBOR pact. So when the item is entire string, then it's simple without binary string. Then CBOR pact is very complex, ad hoc, and don't support many things. For example, CBOR sequences. CBOR do support them. I made reusing already existing tags to switch for decoder state with text 63 for CBOR sequence, text 24 for complete CBOR item, and dictionary. Multiple dictionary is what I think about right now. It's not finished. It's going far beyond CBOR pact goals in this place. It's more like a JSON LD or something like that. So for multiple dictions, alternative stacks were used. 7 in short range, 2 bytes, and up to 128 in total. I'm reading the chat.
We are still talking about pact in the chat, so please go ahead.
Yeah, nothing in the chat.
Okay, I'll continue. Yes, my main concern is compression ratio. Well, I made CBOR 2 phases. The inner phase is atom replacing. That's what the constrained device they may stop it here. And outer phase for applying generic compressor. For if in most easy implementation, that will be 2 buffer copies. However, in just using atoms, it's possible to use CBOR just the way CBOR pact is assumed. That is accessing to the data in place without any temporary memory buffers unpacking to them. That is, you can see that definition is where it is. That is definition is allowing the byte dictionary for example, in inflates a dictionary function, but this is optional. This for the multiple dictionary and not in a binary string, but the CBOR structure itself. You can see example on the slide. When the single atom number on different levels, I use it, well, like everything already written here. So
Just brief interruption, if I may. I'd like to get to a bit of discussion. Is there maybe a single whole document that you could show in coming to a conclusion, so that we can have questions as well? Because we'll only have 3 minutes left, so I'd like
well, I posted a draft of draft of specification into my list. Everything can be read here. So I see that there much of confusion both for CBOR pact and for CBOR. So the main point is that here, well, on this slide, you can see that in contrast to CBOR pact shuffle and external reference, this is already made in functions for using multiple dictionary and external ones, and for generic manipulation of dictionary to make short references also. You can shift, remove elements. This is a generic function that can do anything, not just shuffle. And last, here is the example of CBOR pact from its draft, and here are the problems on it. The draft says it's very easy and trivial to access the data in place, but this is not true in general. It's only true when entire string is replaced by just one integer. The CBOR does this also, but for complex cases, as you can see on the slide, that single string is not very easy to access, especially in constrained code. You need to build some memory structures that can occupy many space, and this is very complex. Well, let me list it. Go. Again, CBOR pact is not draft is not does not define for which class constrained device it's expected to be used. For example, RFC 7400 suggests there are at least some space for temporary buffers that for easy of implementation. if you want easy implementation that is less ROM, then you must have less code, and so this is simple, less bugs to copy it into intermediate builder. But CBOR also allows, just as implementing it in Metaphor on POSIX shell with make file. It's possible. So additional features that Packard don't have, and finally all this has for much cheaper price. CBOR currently requires just one tag instead of millions, and instead of 40 in 1+1 space. So as this is possible, that so I claim that CBOR Pact can be redone without using so many tags. As the same compression ratio was achieved. So now your questions.
Yeah, we are already at the top of the hour, so that leaves us not much room for questions. But who has any? Please speak up right now. I don't think we're getting kicked out right at the moment, but people might already have to leave. See Joe. So one thing that I take away here is that Pact will need more realistic examples. Because I don't think that those string splicing examples are necessarily the ones where CBOR Pact is that are representative of how it is going to be used. Is there a code implementation that we could, when you mentioned complexity, is there an implementation in code of a generic processor that you could link already to where we could compare complexities?
Well, my English is not very good. I didn't quite understand the question.
Is there an example of software that you can link to that was linked, where we can compare how complex this is compared to Pact implementations?
Well, I don't have any implementations yet, but as you can see by comparing specifications, for the simple cases, CBOR Pact, CBOR is simpler. It have only one table. It expands items going from left to right without need to keep cross references until you want to do that thing for in-place access. So even common wisdom is that even DNS label compression was a mistake. It was a source of security vulnerabilities. So CBOR specifications describes in terms of copying because it suggests to do it this way, but it does not prohibit to implement it just as CBOR Pact. So it's usable instead for the stated goal.
I see a question from Martin, please.
Yeah, you just mentioned DNS compression. Are you aware of my draft about DNS in CBOR, where I actually use Pact at the moment for name compression and also address compression? Do you think that could also be possible with CBOR?
Yes, I've looked into your draft at night and saw that it do not have the actual section for applying CBOR Pact. It just states in just a few paragraphs that it is possible.
Yeah, but there is actually a pull request open at the moment where I use actually also CBOR Pact for name compression. So currently the name compression is implemented completely differently in the current version of the draft, but there is a version that moves that to Pact CBOR to to a variant of that. I would be just interested into your opinion on that.
Well, I didn't see that that code, but what I can say you about CBOR pact, it have only prefix or suffix compression, and CBOR allows you to put multiple atoms in one string. So so for DNS, for each label, it may be you maybe achieve it even better than CBOR pact, at least in a simple way. For example, if your domain has 5 labels, you can have that just 5 atoms in one string referring to each label. Yes, and in CBOR pact, you will need to address in argument table 4 references for each of the. This is more complex for encoder.
Okay, thank you. We are already 6 minutes over time, so I'm afraid we should we'll need to wrap it up here. Thank you all for your input. Let's continue discussions on the mailing list and see how we continue from there, because that's right now I don't have any good steps forward to suggest other than like continuing the list threads and evaluating what we have around.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. See you on the list and in the next interim in 2 weeks.
All right. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.